DataTutors Services boost the effectiveness of analytical system users of all levels. We know that it's real-world scenarios and use cases that stick, driving adoption and ultimately, project success. We've walked in your shoes and understand what your team needs to learn. We know how they learn best, and when our training is complete, users can apply their knowledge directly to what they do. There's one key word absent from most training classes, but present during the design of every good real-world app or dashboard. That word is workflow, and understanding the difference between a presentation of data and a workflow is what would make a designer exceptional. In this video, I'm going to focus on some of the aspects that play into the workflow of an exception analysis, namely the selector types and a couple visualizations, and we've got the perfect dataset to do it. For the first time, Medicare and Medicaid have released submitted charge and payment information for physicians and their organizations. I've got here a MicroStrategy report that contains 3 different types of healthcare providers, ranging from occupational therapy and sports medicine all the way to ophthalmology in the state of Florida. For those physicians, we've got their total billed amounts, total paid, and average billed and paid amounts, broken by the HCPCS code that they use to bill CMS for the treatment. We've also got the total number of services provided, as well as the number of unique beneficiaries or patients that have received those treatments. Now, for a long time, publication of this data faced resistance over concerns that if taken out of context, transparency might lead to finger pointing in the wrong directions or put physicians under the microscope under false presumptions. A number of articles pointed out a certain Dr. Melgen for comment simply because his office had received the greatest amount of Medicare/Medicaid payments, totaling over $20 million in the year 2012. The greatest amount submitted for billing, or the greatest amount received, however, isn't quite a rigorous criteria for recognizing fraud. At DataTutors, we want to show how to build a workflow so that users can perform a more rigorous analysis to understand whether publishers like USA Today should be pressing the issue with Dr. Melgen's office or not. And in doing so, we want to lay out a framework for exception analysis to find anomalies in any data, whether it's CMS physician billing or for your business. In this case, we have to build a solid workflow that lets users discover physicians and potential candidates for fraud inspection while always comparing them to similar peers. And as I get into Visual Insight to prototype, I'll select a visualization that's great for finding exceptions, the bubble map. It's easy to be overwhelmed by a bubble grid and get lost in the need for at least 3 metrics that are somehow related. But to keep it simple, we can really just choose 2 metrics that we know will relate to one another, and then it will jump off the page when something reaches some sort of extreme. Plotting total submitted charges on the x-axis and then the total payments received on the y, with a bubble for each doctor's office, we should see a general trend that shows that if I charge more, I receive more. But when bubbles range high above or down below the general trend line, we know that a physician is either charging more and receiving less than peers, or charging less and receiving more than we would expect. Physicians or offices that charge or receive an abnormal amount will stand out right away because they won't be right on that line. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions yet, because right now, we're looking at all the physicians with no bearing on whether we've got apples to apples. So look what happens when I add colors for the different care provider types. Ophthalmologists charge more and receive more than their peers, of course, because of more expensive and more covered procedures than sports medicine or occupational therapy physicians. We need a way to parse it down. One big bubble chart with all those offices won't cut it. When producing a workflow, it's important to know the difference and recognize a need for either a smart, data-based selector or a regular selector, which to the user might feel like a blind choice. Now obviously, data-based selectors produce an ideal user experience for drilling into a subset, but at the same time, it's not always necessary or possible with limited screen real estate to make everything a smart selection. So in our example, it would almost never make sense to compare an ophthalmologist to an occupational therapist or sports medical physician. They're totally different in how much they charge, what kind of services they offer, and most importantly, users will never be bothered by a fork in the road to choose just one of them at a time. This is the perfect candidate for a plain old, non-data-based selector like a drop-down, button bar, or the page by that I'm going to add to this dashboard. That distinction is always significant when you're choosing selector types in any dashboard or app. The desired user workflow should always drive the design decisions that we make. Now, my bubble chart is starting to make a little bit more sense. On the other hand, there are some charges within one type of provider that should also be filtered out. These are the choices that are a little bit more like splitting hairs than picking apples and oranges. For example, repairing one eye lesion in a surgery will be charged a lot differently than treating multiple eye lesions. As I sift through different treatments though, I don't want to just be aimlessly wandering through a field of service types. One, because there are a ton of them, and two, because some might be more likely candidates for fraud than others, maybe because of a higher price or a lower price. This is a case for a smart, data-based selector. Specifically, this type of scenario is in the heat maps wheelhouse. Like pie charts, heat maps can be overused or misused in dashboard or apps, but in this case, it's a great choice to both show the data and select the data, and we'll see why. Because I need to see both the physician services that comprise the largest portion of payouts, while also dictating through the color of this rectangle which ones are on average the costliest. So the heat map is answering two questions. One, where we're going to spend most of our money, and two, in how big of chunks we spend it on that service. When I tell this heat map to act as a selector for the bubble map, we're carrying the answers to both of those questions along with us to the next step of analyzing the bubbles for each physician. When picking out potential targets for cost savings or anomalies, the heat map is one great way to show a proportion of a whole and a scalar rate simultaneously. So we're looking for a big, easy cost savings target that comprises a lot of our healthcare spend, while also displaying in deep green to indicate that the particular procedure is a relatively expensive one, where a fraudulent charge or two might make a big difference for us. So let's look at the ophthalmologists. There appears to be an overwhelmingly large contributor to the CMS spend on ophthalmology, and it's a deep shade of green, implying that this money is spent in large chunks. Let's check out that treatment by clicking on it. I know that its drug is actually called Lucentis, and see how the physicians delivering it shake out.
On first glance, there appears to be one office charging CMS huge amounts of money, billing over 17 million and receiving over 10. This bubble reaches high above the others in both of those respects, and when targeted for the specific treatment by the heat map, this office is being compared to its peers. Unsurprisingly, it turns out that this is Dr. Melgen's office, the one that showed up in a number of news media outlets. It looks like something is going on here because of the placement of this bubble, but we can't really determine why yet, because realistically, any justification is still in play. One could argue that more business meant more treatments, which incurred higher bills. Nonetheless, it seems like some analysts stopped here and wrote their article. Some went straight for the deep dive on the office to try to gain more specific knowledge. But at DataTutors, we argue that we haven't finished with the data's story yet. There's still a lot that a well-trained MicroStrategy user can explore. So how or why does this office exist at the extreme? Are they charging more per patient? Let's use the size of the bubble to try to see if that's why Melgen's office climbs so high on the bubble chart. Is it that they treat more people? I can try that instead, but the answers to both of those questions appear to be no and no, because when I look at the bubbles, it doesn't look like the size jumps off the page for quantity of patients or amount charged per patient. But what about the number of treatments per patient?
When I add that to the size by, we've actually found a possible candidate for the difference between these high bubbles and the rest of the bubbles. The size of the bubble is almost twice the size of the others for Melgen's office, telling me that patients at this office get treated with the injection nearly twice as frequently, twice as many times per year as at other peer physicians' offices. Now it's important to remember that with something as sensitive as fraud, and whenever we're using a visualization, we need to be especially wary of the difference between correlation and proof of causality. There could always be a lurking variable behind a visualization. For example, Melgen may provide service to patients who need help the most, and that could easily explain more frequent service or a doctor that's highly in demand or something along those lines. And so with any business data, the numbers or visuals alone can't prove guilt or innocence. But a well-planned workflow does let users make discoveries that get closer to the truth, much more easily and accurately. And though USA Today and others might have been barking up the right tree with Melgen's office, our creation would have pushed analysts further to more specific questions about why Dr. Melgen's patients received twice as many treatments of this expensive medication as beneficiaries from other offices. For your business, that means a deeper level of inquiry and understanding of your data. When we put together a good exception analysis that utilizes the right types of selectors, the right types of visualizations, and offers to mix, match, and move those metrics all over the place, users can much more readily arrive at the point of actionable, data-driven insights.
For a free education assessment or a demonstration of Maestro, an interactive end-user training framework designed to integrate seamlessly into your dashboards, please contact us.